All right, let's dig deeper into the latest report from the Fate Institute. We have Beyond the Hospital Awakening. Also, the State of Entrepreneurship in Nigeria report, 2025. Joining us to unpack this, we have Amaka Nwaokolo. She's a director at the Fate Institute. She's joining me right here in the studio. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good to be here.
And via Zoom, we have Dr. Wilson Erumebor, is Economist and Fellow at Fate Institute. Join me via Zoom. Great to have you on the show, sir. Good morning.
Good to be here.
Fantastic. All right, let's begin with industrialization. And I'll start with you, Dr. Erumebor. Beyond the hustle, Nigeria's in an industrial reawakening. We see the data there showing that, from 1990s to about 2023, we've seen a manufacturing share of real GDP. It was over 20% in the early 1990s, according to your data. And looking, forward, it's been dropping. We've seen 8.6%, 2023, 2024, less than 9%, about 8.4%. Specifically, break down the key highlights, from the report for me.
Yes, thank you for having me once again. I think what the data shows is that if you look at Nigeria in terms of how the manufacturing sector has performed, from about 3-4 decades ago, what you'd find is what people would call sort of like a premature deindustrialization, where the share of manufacturing is dropping, but it's dropping at a point where your income, your per capita income, has not reached its peak or is still a bit low. We're still somewhere around $1,000, per capita income. So that's basically what we've seen, and it alludes to the fact that other sectors, particularly the services sector, if you remember in the 2000s, we implemented sort of like a liberalization policy which opened up key sectors like the telecoms, banking, and a couple of other service-related sectors. So what that data just shows is that other sectors in services have grown significantly and even more faster than our manufacturing sector. So if you then go to export, for instance, only about 3% of total goods that we exported in 2024 was manufactured goods. So basically, the long and short story is that Nigeria is not producing enough, both for local consumption and also for export. There are many reasons we can allude to that, but if you then look at our manufacturing sector in terms of the terms of trade, so what do we export and what do we import in terms of manufactured goods? We're still in a trade deficit. We've been in a trade deficit for quite a long time now. So we import more manufactured goods than we export, and the figures is around 24 trillion in deficit. Just this year alone, the first half of this year, we've done about 14 trillion negative. So our import of manufactured goods, the value of import of manufactured goods is higher than the export of manufactured goods by 14 trillion. That's quite a huge number, which also means that we may even surpass what we achieved, about the 24-25 trillion we achieved last year. So over the years, we've seen that sort of neglect, just for lack of a better word, of the manufacturing sector. And if you look at the firm dynamics, you would see that small businesses, the smaller outfits in manufacturing, have been the hardest hit, especially when it comes to all of these policy, foreign exchange problems, or whether it's issues relating to power and all of that. They are the most affected. And then when you look at the structure of the sector, you would see that only 3 subsectors within manufacturing account for about 70% of manufacturing output. So again, we're talking here about cement, food and beverage, and textiles. So again, there's even lack of diversity within manufacturing. Then at the firm level, you would see that most of our manufacturing firms, which I think was really highlighted in the report and is very important, is that many of our firms operate at the subsistence level. 91% is what we estimated. And in terms of employment, about 73% of workers in this sector are self-employed. So we just have this one-man business type manufacturing outfit, which again is not the kind of manufacturing that would move the needle in terms of lifting people out of poverty or moving Nigeria to the next stage of development.
Right. So, technically what you're saying is, we produce stuff, but we're not producing the big stuff, that the likes of maybe China, when it comes to, production of phones and all of those kind of big stuff. So what would you say is stopping us? I spoke with a manufacturer recently, and he talked about the cost of power in China. He said it costs 2x more for electricity in Nigeria, than China.
Yeah.
So it's tough, for our producers to actually compete, but how about the technological side of things? How does all of this play out?
Oh, yeah, it's challenging for businesses, especially the nano, micro, small businesses in the sector. For the large firms, the dynamics is a bit different because they have the capital, they have the skill. In some cases, they can hire skilled labor even from abroad to complement some of the shortfalls we have locally. But for the smaller firms, it's difficult because, again, technology is expensive. And if you look at the State of Entrepreneurship Report 2025, when businesses were asked, why don't you adopt technology? Guess one of the top reasons they cited, cost. The cost of acquiring the kind of technology they need, to be able to improve productivity. And so there is still a lot of work to do in terms of training, in terms of access. But what we've seen so far, especially even within the manufacturing sector, is that businesses are using technology to access markets. So we're talking here of social media, being able to trade, to access other markets, even in some cases export to other countries, trying to leverage on social media, which again is a part of technology, WhatsApp and the likes. But more importantly is the fact that when we talk about technology within the sector, or technology in terms of using technology for productivity, I think that's much of where the biggest technology is concerned. And it speaks to a whole lot of a broader issue that I think, the government has to, in a way, step up and intervene to support some of these small firms to be able to acquire that much needed technology that will raise productivity.
Right. And when you talk about support there, when I see the way, governments in China support the manufacturers there, it's quite incredible. And I guess that's why they're able to, compete and, export to the world at this point. All right, let me bring in Amaka now. We also have the 2025 State of Entrepreneurship, index. And there's a paradox there. It looks like the entrepreneurs are kind of like optimistic. This time.
Yes. So thank you, Ladi. I think to delve into that question, I'll provide a bit of a background context. For us to assess entrepreneurial activity across the states in Nigeria, we look at 5 pillars. We look at skills acquisition, we look at business performance, we look at enabling environment, we look at perception of opportunities, which is where optimism comes in, and then we look at technology and innovation. What we found this year is that for the very first time in 5 years, we've been putting out this report just tracking data across the ecosystem, and I'm talking 36 states, including the FCT. What we found was that for the very first time, we saw a slight increase in the index, right? So last year, we were at 0.46, and typically we measure this on a scale between 0 and 1, right? So 0.50, meaning average, right? Now, this year, we're at 0.47. So we're not up to the average, meaning we're not doing fantastically well. However, there's a slight jump, not even a jump, a slight move, I would say, from last year. And so that for us signals that a lot of entrepreneurs are optimistic about the future. If we look at the index and look at the different pillars, you will still find that there are issues. So for example, skills acquisition and enabling environment still rank the bottom or the least on the index. So there's still a lot of problem that we need to consider. And case in point, like Dr. Erumebor was saying, skills. It's when we're talking about technology or talking a bit about businesses growing, skills is a critical part. And if we look at the index, we see that it's ranking low, meaning that a lot of businesses would rather invest in staying afloat than maybe taking an extra course or something, right? But if we look at technology adoption, we saw a slight move from last year, right? Which again signals that people are maybe adopting technology a little more. But again, when we talk about technology, we find that for a lot of businesses, it's really about social media. How do you adopt social media to maybe access markets? But technology is broader than that. It's saying, how do you deploy, machineries that can improve efficiency in your operations, right? So for us, we still think that there's a whole lot that can be done in terms of...
So it's not just about dancing and selling on social media.
Well, dancing and selling gets the markets, doesn't it? So,
it does.
Yeah, it does, but it's not just about that.
Right.
You're right about that. But then again, in terms of perception of opportunities, which is where this question really hinges on, we saw a slight move. Last year was 0.70, this year 0.72, meaning a lot of businesses are optimistic. And it's easy to see why we can point to certain things in the economy. For example, the harmonization of the foreign exchange windows, because that was a major issue. So we're seeing a bit of improvement in the economy, right? So in a way, I guess that businesses are sort of getting these feelers in the economy, and that's what translated in the survey.
Right, but we're also seeing, even with that optimism, they're not creating that much jobs as they should.
Right. And this is where I would piggyback on what Dr. Erumebor has said, because what we still find in the ecosystem is that you have a lot of businesses operating at the bottom of the pyramid, so operating at the nano, micro level. So case in point, subsistence or survivalist businesses. What we need to see is that we need to see businesses transition at scale from nano to micro to small to medium. Because like Dr. Erumebor was saying, what we find is that you have a lot of businesses at the bottom. You have a few small and medium, and then a couple of large firms, right? And for us to industrialize and really get to the point where our MSMEs are powering the economy and creating the jobs that we need to see that happen at scale. Meaning we cannot see a few businesses survive in Lagos, Abuja, Port Harcourt. No, it has to happen across board. So there needs to be some inclusive approach that is implemented now for us to see that happen.
Right.
So you're right, we're not seeing as many jobs as we should, but again, this all ties to some of the typical issues that exist within the ecosystem that honestly, urgently require attention.
Right, and is there, looking at that, optimism, do you think entrepreneurs are bullish on, hiring maybe later on in 2026 going forward? Do you see them?
Well, the good thing about the State of Entrepreneurship report is that we track data every year. So we'll see what this looks like in the new year. Right now, what we found was that only 4 firms, 1 in every 4 firms, hired just 1 person. So I guess the simplest response to that would be, if things keep up, if we continue to sort of uphold the reforms that are ongoing now, and then also inject some form of support or create frameworks or structure that supports businesses, then we can begin to see these numbers stack up, right? Because at the end of the day, it's really about consistency, right? We can't get results with one-off interventions and programs. It's that we're doing this consistently. You talked about China. I mean, China for me is one story that I find inspiring, especially when I read about their trajectory, how they started in the 1940s to the 1960s. There was a lot of intentionality when it comes to the design of their policies and the implementation, holding their government accountable and ensuring that year on year, those policies are implemented. So of course, it's no surprise that today they are the manufacturing superpower of the world.
I get jealous when I hear the kind of support they give to entrepreneurs and manufacturers in the country.
But it's not rocket science, and we can do that here as well. But we need some form of intentional thinking when it comes to our policies and implementation. I think that's the major issue
implementation.
Here. Backed by implementation.
Right.
And monitoring as well.
Let's bring in Dr. Erumebor to this conversation now. We're still talking about industrialization and credit, cost of credit. I know that's another big issue, and the Monetary Policy Committee, they did cut rates at the previous meeting. They're starting the meeting today. Tomorrow we'll get a decision. Consensus is another rate cut. But looking at where interest rates are, right now, are you optimistic about the industrialization drive, with the cost of credit right now and seeing the direction, it's going?
No, I'm not.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's just a simple way, because there is no economy, I think, that can industrialize with interest rate at 30+%, right? The MPC has started to, slow down or to reduce rates, but still, we're talking, somewhere around 27%. I just got messages whether, what my prediction is, will they cut rate or retain? Because again, we're very clear that the MPC will not raise rates, at the forthcoming meeting. But back to the point on industrialization, it's still really expensive, and that's something, that I think demands urgent attention. And in fact, one thing I also, would say is that countries that are in this dilemma of, raising rates to attract foreign investment, but at the same time, trying to keep investment within the financial sector just so you can avoid, weaker currency or instability in the exchange rate. Countries that fall within that category, what would typically happen is that development finance, comes in to fill that gap that the private sector, cannot fill. And part of why I went straight to no is because just looking at credit to the private sector, only 1% of credit to the private sector in 2024, only 1.2% of total credit to the private sector went to small-scale enterprises. 1.2%, Ladi. This is close to zero. And it tells you some of the factors. And when you ask businesses, if you check through the State of Entrepreneurship report, one of the key reasons is high interest rates. And then there are issues relating to, collateral, strenuous collateral demand, which affects female-led businesses disproportionately, female and youth-led businesses. So we can't industrialize with that kind of environment. Development finance has to come in. Another, sad reason again is when you then look at development finance, right? Just pick BOI, the Bank of Industry, which again is one of the top development finance institutions. Only 15% of their loan portfolio for 2024 went to small businesses, right? Went to medium, small enterprises, right? So, and there's even medium there within that 15%. So if we then remove the medium firms, it means the smaller firms will take much lesser than 15%. So the way we've thought about financing for industrialization has to change going forward. I see industrialization as something that is really crucial. In fact, it's almost paramount to issues relating to security, because if you don't create the jobs, if you don't get people gainfully employed and engaged productively, they will resort to violence, insecurity, and create social disorder. So this is something that has to be at the front burner. And I've always argued that industrialization is something that needs to sit within the presidency because of how urgent and how important it is. And so that's one way to drive the much needed attention to the sector, to the industrial sector, and secondly, to the finance issue. And our approach to solving some of these problems, Ladi, is that we always think about throwing money at problems. When we have a problem, the next thing we announce 100 billion XYZ fund for textiles. That cannot work because, again, you hardly find people that get access to these funds, right? So we're saying there has to be that holistic reform to say, how do we appoint credible people to manage government funds in a way that we're giving them very clear KPIs? This is how much you need to support SMEs. This is the XYZ percentage you need to. And the president sits and follows through on all of that. Because if we don't do that, we'll just keep announcing funds. Just 2 years ago, the president announced a 75 billion naira funds for manufacturers. The question is, where are we with those funds? Who has gotten those funds? So those are key problems that I think demand urgent attention from the presidency. As much as we're paying attention to insecurity, which we have to, of course, industrialization is something that needs to be given that same attention because it is crucial. Right now, countries are talking about industrial policy across the world. Even countries that believed in free markets, the US, they have the CHIPS Act. Biden, had the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. Trump, of course, with his tariffs. The essence is they've understood that industrialization has to come in. We cannot leave the market. The state has to play that role. Nigeria should do the same, Ladi.
Right. And, still looking at that enterprise structure and the missing middle data, total MSMEs in Nigeria, about almost 40 million, powering daily economic activity. Enterprises at nano, micro level, nearly 97%. Very few transition to small, medium-sized business, according to the data there. So when you talk about that missing middle, help us break that down. And how do you measure closing that gap?
Yeah, interesting, because we just decided to say what's in manufacturing. Every time everybody talks about the fact that manufacturing is the way forward. But I think, we took an approach that says that's not enough. Let's even x-ray the manufacturing sector in Nigeria and see what's in there. Is it the kind of manufacturing that can lift people out of poverty, as we've seen in China and the likes? So in doing that, what came out very clearly is that the way it's structured, there are just a few firms, a few big firms at the top, and then we have millions of nano, micro, small firms at the bottom. We're talking of millions, and then there's a gap in the middle, which we call the missing middle. That if you study countries that have industrialized, there is always a group of firms within that middle base that can, supply input to some of the large firms and at the same time pull up some of the small firms. And what we've also argued is that the small firms can even grow. If we, Adenike was speaking about earlier, she was speaking about how do we identify the firms with very much potential, high potential firms within that small category and provide them with very targeted support, whether it's finance, skills, technology, just so they can grow and play that missing middle role. Because that's really the base, or I described it as the connective tissue of industrialization. If you're able to grow that middle base, even with South Korea, if you study South Korea and you see the showballs, some of these large firms, they rely extensively on those middle firms to supply their input or to provide other related services to them. But for us, what's currently filling that gap, that missing middle gap, it's imports. So you see that across different products, Nigeria imports so many things that it can produce. Just go to the top firms. You would see how much exposure they have to imported input. That's because there are very few firms that can supply these firms. And this is not just about policy alone, right? It's an opportunity for more businesses to step in across the value chain, across different products. We're talking whether cassava, cocoa, so many products. You will see that there are opportunities within that middle for that missing middle to be filled. I think that's basically what we've
right.
How we conceptualize it.
All right, definitely a lot to fill there when it comes to that missing middle. But let's bring in Amaka now. I also see in the data there, female-led businesses reporting higher growth rates, despite lower access, to capital, because we always hear, when it comes to startups, the male-led startups seem to get most of the attention, when it comes to funding. But we're seeing female-led businesses actually growing. How's that?
So the data around female-led businesses this year is quite interesting because we actually saw a dip in the number of female-led businesses this year, right?
Okay, so the number of female-led businesses are
dropped, but we had an increase in the number of those that experienced growth this year. So it was an interesting juxtaposition, so to speak. But What we find, though, in terms of growth is that female-led businesses are very agile and quick to adapt technology, and so able to access markets. And so that's one assumption for the growth that we're seeing this year. However, I think that what's a bit concerning for us, just looking at the numbers, is that the number of businesses, female-led businesses, actually dropped, and that again sort of speaks to some of the issues that exist within the ecosystem. The challenges that female-led businesses experience. The top 3 challenges that they cited were access to funding, which you just mentioned. There was energy. And so when you look at these issues, there are issues that exist for everyone, but female-led businesses tend to just experience it, differently. And so for us, again, in terms of just going forward, is saying, can we begin to look at some of these gaps and intentionally begin to bridge those gaps? Because not only would it empower MSMEs, but it would also, guide us on that path to industrialization, which is what we want to achieve and see.
Right. So definitely a lot to look at when it comes to funding, female. So
funding, yes.
Female-led businesses.
Yeah, when it comes to also addressing the energy issues. Do the banks see them as more risky?
Interestingly,
I know, because we carried out a different study that actually showed that women are very quick to repay. So when it comes to repayments of their debt, they're very quick, they're on time, much better than the men. Not because I'm a woman, but that's what the data is. But that's what the data is saying. So I don't think that banks necessarily see them as risky. I guess they're just different dynamics here, because one, even the female-led businesses need to be a bit more confident in just going out there to take this funding, because what we find is that the men are more, what's the word now, aggressive a bit.
When it comes to getting the funding.
Yeah, just when it comes to just going out there, even when they're not qualified. Yeah, even when they're not qualified, they will take that step. A woman might be qualified, but she would hold herself back and think, oh no, I still need to get more qualifications. I need to find this, I need to find that before I take that step, So if we unpack that, there's actually a whole lot, just within that topic alone. But when it comes to repayments of debts and loans, women do actually do great.
All right, man, that's a challenge for us. We need to pay our loans faster. No, at this point. Thank you so much. It was great having this conversation with you. Amaka Nwaokolo is director at the Fate Institute, and we had Dr. Wilson Erumebor via Zoom, Economist and Fellow at Fate Institute. Thank you both for coming on today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
All right, we'll take a break now. We'll also get a check on how small businesses can access capital through the capital market. That's in a moment. Just stay with us.